Good morning. This is Let's Talk New Mexico, and I'm your host, Jeanette Didios from the Hicker, Apache, and Dene Nations. Early voting started this week with primary elections on June 2nd. On the ballot are candidates for governor and lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, land commissioner, and all the seats in the state House of Representatives. Also in the mix are members of Congress and one senator. With last year's passage of Senate Bill 16, New Mexico is implementing a semi-open primary system this year. That means people who are not registered with a major party can now vote in those primaries. At the same time, the ranks of voters in the state registering as independents have been growing faster than those who register as Democrats or Republicans after New Mexico implemented an automatic voter registration system. But what exactly is a semi-open primary election, and what does that mean for you? On this week of Let's Talk New Mexico, we'll be breaking down the ins and outs of what a semi-open primary is and how it will impact New Mexicans when they go to vote. And we want to hear from you. What questions do you have coming into election season? Are you an independent voter or belong to a minority party? Do you know the steps to ensure your vote counts? Call us at 505-277-5866. That's 505-277-KUNM. You can also send questions or comments to letstalk@kunm.org. Now, I want to introduce all my guests for this morning. First, we have Scylla Avgil, who is the Executive Director for NM Voters First. Scylla, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Jeanette. Thanks for having me.
We also have Executive Director for Common Cause, Molly Swink. Good morning, Molly.
Good morning.
Then we have our spokesperson for the state's Secretary of the State's Office, Lindsay Bachman. Lindsay, hello.
Good morning.
And last but certainly not least, we have Michael Thorning, who is the Director of Structural Democracy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so I want to start with Scylla first, but just a reminder, if any of my guests have anything to add to the discussion, please jump in. So the primary reason for this show is to both inform and educate. So with that being said, Scylla, what exactly is a semi-open primary?
So a semi-open primary is when only those registered as independent or declined to state in the state of New Mexico can participate in the primary election without having to change their voter registration. Now, in previous years, those voters had to go and do same-day registration, stand in a different line, and then they were able to go in the actual line to be able to vote so that they could get their ballots once they changed their registration. But now what is going to happen is that these voters, independent and declined to state voters, will just show up to the polls and tell the poll worker which party's ballot they want. So the ballots of the major parties are still separated. The only major difference is that instead of having to do same-day registration, independents can now just show up and tell the workers which ballot they want.
So Senate Bill 16 passed just last year during the legislative session. Can you give me a background on how long it actually took to pass this measure?
Yes, so it was a 10-year effort. We are not a ballot initiative state, which means all law changes have to go through the legislature. And on average, it takes a bill 10 years from conception into signing into law, on average 10 years to pass. And so it took exactly 10 years for Senate Bill 16 to pass. Within those years, organizations were building volunteer bases, coalitions. And when I stepped in, I was able to create this statewide coalition to show that, hey, this isn't just an issue that 3 or 4 people support in the state. This is an important issue for the entire state and all these diverse organizations. And so with that, we were able to also build relationships with leadership in the House and the Senate so that we could get more support, and obviously as well from the governor's office. So we're very grateful for all the hard work and the tears and sweat that went into the 10 years of passing this bill.
And I want to ask you as well, what were some of the reasons why people were against it?
Within those past 10 years, right, there were many talking points as to why people were against the issue. It was a lot of old school thinking that like, oh, if you want to vote in a Democratic or a Republican primary, you should be a member of that party. But we had to re-educate our legislators that, hey, the parties don't pay for the primaries, the taxpayers do. And if all taxpayers can't have access to an election that they pay for equally, then what kind of democracy are we running here in New Mexico? We also had to use, real numbers and data showing that a lot of young voters were more and more registering as independent. And so that was another thing we had to let legislators know is that, hey, like if the next generation is not participating in our elections, our democracy will be doomed. And I think those talking points really helped get the message across.
So with this new measure, Molly, can you walk me through the new process for independent voters? What are the new things they will have to do when they go to vote in person and by mail?
So this new process really makes things simpler for independent and declined to state voters. So I myself am a declined to state voter and I'm an absentee voter. I just find it easier to vote, have my ballot sent to me and vote from home. So I know this process personally. When I went to apply for my absentee ballot, you have to do the regular application stuff, enter your name, your driver's license number, make sure that all the information is correct. And then the Secretary of State's office made it very simple. There's just a little drop-down menu where you choose which ballot you want sent to you. So independent and declined to state voters will just, with that drop-down menu, pick the ballot that most likely or that most aligns with their values so that they can vote on that party ticket. When folks go in person, it's very similar. They'll just, when folks go to the polling location, Lindsay, correct me if I'm wrong, when they talk to the poll workers and confirm who they are, they'll just request either the Democratic or the Republican ticket.
And how was this process different from how things were done before?
So in previous years, Scylla had mentioned it. So independent and declined to state voters had to change their voter registration in order to participate. So they had to either re-register as a Democrat or a Republican. This really just, we see that as a barrier. Like they can use same day voter registration, but it's just another extra step for voters to take before they get to make their voice heard. So this simplifies the process.
And you said you are an independent voter. Would you say this former process was ineffective?
I just found it extra tedious to be able to participate in what Scylla said is a taxpayer primary, funded primary. I did change my party at every primary so that I could participate and then had to change it back. So it's just extra work for voters. And Common Cause, we really want to make sure that any eligible voter who wants to vote is able to without extra hurdles, barriers, or challenges.
And I'd like to hear from both Molly and Scylla on this one as well. But how is both NM Voters First and Common Cause pushing to inform voters this election?
Scylla, do you want to jump in?
Okay. Sure. So we have a statewide implementation coalition right now. Many partners who helped us pass the bill in 2025 are now part of this implementation coalition and even more organizations. Because I believe we had about 22 nonprofits supporting the bill, and now we have almost 30 nonprofits supporting the implementation. And what we're trying to do is let the 370,000 voters know that they're able to vote in primaries without added barriers now, which is no easy task, to speak for myself at the very least. We have canvassers, we have mailers, we have radio ads, we have TV and streaming ads going around. We have flyers in all the languages that are being spoken in our state. So we're trying to definitely catch those voters who are either newly registered, they've been independents forever, they've just never voted in a primary. We're even trying to work with candidates that are on the ballot so that they can do outreach to independents and let them know that they can vote in a very nonpartisan manner, because we're not supporting any candidate, but we are helping all the candidates have the resources necessary so that they can tell voters the correct information. And so we are trying to cover all of our bases and just let folks know that this is the first year that they get to vote in primaries.
Thanks, Scylla. Yeah, and Common Cause was able to hire an organizer to do community education around semi-open primaries. So our organizer has been working to build relationships with local election administrators and host events with their offices. He actually is hosting an event in Las Cruces this evening with coalition partners and the local election administrators. And we will be doing that also in Albuquerque, and I feel like there was another one, but now I'm drawing a blank, Scylla. But he's on the ground trying to talk to voters, meet voters where they are. So at community events, at local political convenings. He's based in Las Cruces, which has been really, really helpful talking to folks in southern New Mexico.
That's interesting to hear. So, Lindsay, as a spokesperson for the Secretary of State, what role does the office play in elections?
That's a great question. I think in a lot of ways, elections are the most prominent task that the Secretary of State's office has. We are also responsible for things like business filings and sort of commerce and industry. But elections gets all the attention generally. And that's important because the Secretary of State's office is the chief election officer of the state. The office is charged with helping to ensure the uniform application of the state's election code and do things like help support the implementation of new initiatives like semi-open primaries.
And we actually got a comment from one of our listeners, from Jose. He says, "Good morning. Is it possible to vote in both primaries as an independent? If not, why not? Let's have fully open primaries." Molly or Scylla, do you want to take that?
I'm happy to do so. Under the current system, independents can only vote on one party's ballot, maintaining one person, one vote. We did not pass fully open primaries, which I believe is what this listener is referring to, which would be where we would only have one ballot and all the candidates would be presented on the same ballot. Within the 10 years that we were advocating for some form of primary reform in New Mexico, we definitely flirted with the idea of fully open primaries and semi-open primaries. And at the end of the day, it is what the legislature decided. And so that was the bill that was passed.
Michael, would you like to add to this?
Sure. I'd just clarify that, there's no state that allows voters to vote on both parties' primary ballots at once. Now, if New Mexico had adopted an open primary system and all the candidates were competing on the same primary, that would be a different thing. But there's no state where independent voters get to vote in all the parties' primaries at once. As Scylla said, there's a one person, one vote aspect to this, but also just an aspect to it that voters, if they're going to participate in a primary, need to be treated equally across, their party affiliations.
Now, I do want to get back to Lindsay. So there have been reports from other news outlets that out of the 33 counties' websites, 20 make no mention of semi-open primaries. What role does the Secretary of State office play in guiding or maybe enforcing more transparency?
Thank you so much for that question. Ultimately, county clerks are responsible for the information shared on local county clerk websites. However, we have encouraged county clerks to review their websites in the lead up to implementation of semi-open primaries this election so that they accurately reflect information regarding the transition. We've not received formal complaints regarding a specific clerk's website, but should we receive a formal complaint, we have an internal process in which we work with the county clerk to review it and respond accordingly if appropriate.
And we're talking about county clerks right now. What role do they play with elections, and do they work full-time or part-time?
County clerks do the frontline work of democracy in this state. So the way that it works is they're responsible for putting together the nuts and bolts of an election in their county. They go before boards of county commissions to help set polling locations as appropriate for their communities. And they also hire your neighbors, your friends, folks that you know to work the polls throughout the election during early voting and on election day. They are legally responsible for the way that voting activity occurs at polling locations, and they are responsible for preparing the canvass or audit post-election. So they've got a lot of duties. Those are just the highlights, but they really are the true engine of democracy in this state. And then ultimately, they work with us post-election on additional auditing, and they report things to us throughout the election pursuant to state statute regarding security, et cetera. So we work collaboratively. I'm not trying to say that that the Secretary of State's office doesn't play a huge role. I'm just saying that they are the frontline representatives of our democratic process in this state.
All right, I'm going to pause the conversation for a minute. This is Let's Talk New Mexico on 89.9 KUNM. I'm Jeanette Didios. Do you have any questions on how and where to vote? Well, we have a panel of guests that can answer that for you. Just call us at 505-277-5866 or email us at letstalk@kunm.org. Stay with us. Welcome back to Let's Talk New Mexico. I'm Jeanette Didios. We've been talking about semi-open primaries and how it will be impacting New Mexicans, specifically independent voters. And before our break, we were talking to Lindsay. So, Lindsay, what about volunteer election workers? What role do they play as well?
So election workers are actually not volunteer in the sense that I think everyone sort of assumes they are in this state. They are paid. They are required to be paid by state statute, and there are limits to how much they can be paid, but they are paid workers for an election. And those folks are responsible for the supervision of polling sites. They're responsible for the way voters check into those sites, how they navigate them, how they cast their ballot in terms of inserting it into the tabulator, making sure the voter knows everything that they need to know in order to successfully participate in the election. They're also responsible for things like absentee ballot processing. I think there's sort of like often a misconception that election administrators themselves are handling those ballots. At the end of the day, the people processing them, again, are appointed election workers who are required by state statute to be of differing parties. You can't have a board that's entirely Democrat or entirely Republican, and that's by design because the goal is that it's a process in which every voter feels like they are represented and can trust.
So going back to the county clerk's websites that don't currently have semi-open primary awareness, how harmful is that for voters if they're not aware of semi-open primaries, that this would be the first year?
I think what's important is that the public knows that the Secretary of State's office is a trusted source for information related to semi-open primaries. We have a extensive FAQ, so frequently asked questions, document on our website. Voters are really encouraged to check that out at sos.nm.gov. And so if a voter is looking for information and is unable to find it, it sounds like there's a lot of information out there. The Secretary of State's office is a trusted source on the ways in which voters can participate and the technical sort of questions as it relates to how they can. And we hope that they'll visit our website and check it out.
There was also talk of issues regarding voters in some counties who were unable to vote and do same-day registration on Tuesday, which was the first day of early voting. Can you speak towards that?
I can. I understand that what occurred on Tuesday, there was a period of the day in which there was a prohibition from our firewall, so technical security, really important measures that we take place for any election that was inadvertently flagging some counties' communications as nefarious. And so that was handled very promptly by our office. There were about 6 counties that we believe were impacted, that we can confirm were impacted by that technical issue. On the other side of it, there were some sort of growing pains related to a rollout of an update for the secure SDR application. In the lead up to the election, our office worked with county clerks. We provided documented guidance, multiple presentations, recordings of trainings to get everyone ready for the new sort of changes to that system. And ultimately, there were, some first day hiccups that occurred at the county level with about 8 counties. And we don't anticipate any of those small challenges that occurred on the first day of early voting to continue this election.
So, like you mentioned, we've been discussing issues that are already arising, but I'm interested in hearing what planning or preparations have been in the works since the announcement of semi-open primaries. And do you expect any further issues?
Well, Jeanette, that's probably the most boring topic that I could talk about. The steady work of implementation in a bureaucratic environment takes a lot of time, right? So we've been at it since we knew this was going to be something that we needed to be prepared for this year. Regular meetings, talking through technical changes to existing systems. And it was, a very well planned rollout, and we're excited to see how the election takes place this year. Of course, what I always say and what I think is important for the public to know is that human beings are involved in this process. There will be things that we learn based on how the election functions this year that will inform administrative procedure in the years to come. And so no election is perfect because we're all imperfect people participating in it. But we feel very confident about the work that we've done to prepare for it. And yeah, that's kind of where we've landed after a year-long effort.
Well, I want to take a call right now from Claire Jacobson from Albuquerque. She's mentioned that she is a registered Green Party member. Claire, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, the last election that I tried to vote in, it wasn't the last one. I think it was the one before us. They said I could no longer be green, and I'd always been green. Ain't easy, I was quite happy with it. Didn't get any crap in the mail, So, but they did let me vote, but I had to switch. They said the Green Party no longer exists. They don't get federal funding. You cannot be green. So is it independent that I want to change to? Is it, or not non-declared, what is it, declined to state? And how long before an election does one have to change one's affiliation to be able to vote? And okay, number two is, in order to have open primaries, is that going to take another 10 years to get?
Lindsay, would you like to take this?
Sure. Those are really great questions. And so I'd like to start with some definitions, which is also kind of boring, but very important for the purposes of today. And that is, a decline to state voter is someone who is simply not registered with a qualified political party in the state. And so those folks are kind of at the center of the conversation today. But also what I want to make clear is the Green Party is a qualified minor party in the state of New Mexico currently. And because of that qualification, those voters do have a path to participate in the semi-open primary election. But it does look different than those folks who are registered without a qualified political party. And so if you are interested and you are a minor party voter, you can go to a polling location and utilize same-day voter registration. to register with one of the major political parties and participate in one of the major political parties' primary. So there's still an opportunity for you to go out there and participate should you want to make that change and do so.
And it looks like we also have another caller, Bill from Los Lunas. Good morning, Bill. What question do you have for us?
Good morning, ladies. My question is, I search for transparency in elections, and I'm having a problem. I wish you'd answer my question. The ad that Bregman is putting on the video on TV says that it's paid for Accountable New Mexico. Now, I've gone through all searches, and I can't find nothing about that whatever it is, company, title, or I don't know, accountable or whatever. But I can't find no information at all as to paying. They're the ones paying for the ad, Accountable New Mexico, the one Bregman has against Deb Haaland. Now, if Accountable with New Mexico isn't transparent at all as to who they are, isn't that voter fraud, interference? I mean, I want to know everything. I want to know transparency, and that's my point. Thank you.
Lindsay or Molly, would you like to take this?
Sure. So the way that disclaimers occur in advertisings in the state is regulated by the Campaign Reporting Act. And there is a structure for asking questions, raising concerns, wanting to know information. There are also public filings. So it could be that this entity has been filing in our public database. Should you have specific questions, you should definitely reach out to the Secretary of State's office, who can point you in the right direction as to where that information might be publicly available, or answer a specific question related to how that data is appearing online. Like if you don't understand what you're seeing, we're happy to kind of like walk through how all of that functions. And then ultimately, if there is something that is of concern, there's a process for reporting it formally and an investigatory mechanism through the State Ethics Commission, in which those things are researched and evaluated and acted on accordingly. So my response to the caller would be reach out to the Secretary of State's office if you have questions, and we can go from there.
Well, we just heard from a couple callers, which is great, and we're talking about New Mexico's first semi-open primaries. So I want to hear from listeners, more listeners. Do you have a question or comment that you would like to share with us today? There's still plenty of time to call us at 505-277-5866, or you can email us at letstalk@kunm.org. So I want to talk to Molly now. We've been talking a lot during this discussion about New Mexican voters, but Molly, I want to take a minute to talk about the candidates. More specifically, with the implementation of semi-open primaries, how have candidates pivoted towards reaching more independent voters?
That's a really good question. And this is one of the things that we talked about a lot when we were lobbying and how this will impact campaigns. I think for, recent history, candidates have really relied on just reaching out to their party's base. So a Democratic candidate really is just, they're targeting Democratic voters. Republican candidates are targeting Republicans. This new bill really opens the door to a new group of voters who candidates should reach out to, because the number of independent and decline to state voters is continuing to climb. We're at, I think, over 370,000 voters in New Mexico identify as decline to state. So that's 370,000 people that weren't necessarily hearing from candidates before the primary. And so now there's a new base of people that will be contacted and will learn and hear from candidates more.
Now, Michael, you are the Director of Structural Democracy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. What is your organization's interest in primaries?
So that question, Jeanette, we are a national policy nonprofit, and our goal is to try to encourage political systems that really are going to both be fair to both parties, but allow all Americans to participate in our democracy. And we about 10 years ago ourselves started advocating for states to move to more open primary systems for a couple of reasons. One, we recognize that, as Molly was just saying, not just in New Mexico, but across the country, a growing number of voters both were identifying as independents, not identifying with one of the political parties, but also in terms of their actual voter registration, the voter registration of independent or declined to state or unaffiliated voters, depending on where they live, that was also growing. And, so for us, we recognize the importance of keeping their input in the process for winnowing the candidates for the actual general election. The other part of this was just recognizing that as more independent type voters, were leaving the parties and potentially not being able to participate in the primaries, that could create a situation where the people who were affiliated with one of the parties and were still participating in the primaries might have more extreme views than the people who were switching to become independents. And so we had a concern about how the primaries actually might be producing more extreme candidates who would be less likely to either go into government and be at the Roundhouse in Santa Fe or come to the Capitol in Washington and be able to do the hard work of governing, which often really involves bargaining and negotiation. And so, we wanted to make sure that primaries could still produce candidates who'd be effective at governing.
And traditionally, mid-year elections have lower turnouts than general elections, and primaries have even lower participation rates. How do you think open primaries will affect turnout?
Our research shows a few things, which is one, that states with more open type primaries, they perform better in terms of turnout than your more closed systems. And so the more a state moves in the direction of being open, the higher their turnout has tended to be. And we think that's a really good outcome. What we also know is that for individual states, when they actually make that change in the next election, they tend to see a 5 percentage point increase in their primary turnout. That's what our research shows. But also in terms of the unaffiliated voters, we know that they do actually put their money where their mouth is. They show up, they start voting, and on average, we see an increase of about 12 percentage points of the unaffiliated share of the electorate when a state makes that switch to allowing them to participate. So not only do we know that more open primaries increase turnout, we know that it increases the participation from those voters who had previously been locked out. And so we think that's a great outcome.
Well, I'm interested in learning more, Michael, but we're going to take a break really quick. You're listening to Let's Talk New Mexico on 89.9 KUNM. I'm Jeanette Didios. Are you an independent voter? What concerns or questions do you have coming into the state's first semi-open primary? We'd like to hear from you at 505-277-5866, or you can email us at letstalk@kunm.org. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Let's Talk New Mexico on 89.9 KUNM. We're talking about the upcoming semi-open primaries scheduled for June 2nd and how this new measure will impact New Mexican voters. And there's still time to call us at 505-277-5866 to share your thoughts and questions. So before our break, we got a call from Barbara, who is 85, and she wants to know if she votes early, but dies before the general election, will her vote still count? Lindsay, did you have a comment or an answer for that?
Yeah, if I'm understanding correctly, it sounds like if I vote prior to election day, does my vote still count? And the answer is absolutely yes. So there are many ways in which the election code and administrators address early voting. There's a reconciliation process that takes place. There's tons of auditing and chains of custody that exist throughout the early voting process. So voters should feel very confident in the security of their vote and the fact that it's tabulated ultimately.
Now, Michael, there is a lot of messaging right now that the primaries will decide the general election in November. Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. I think what a lot of people have observed over the last 25 years or so, and I think data has certainly borne this out, is that many of our congressional districts, and this translates down in a lot of states to state legislative districts, are not as competitive as they once used to be. Which really means that one of the two parties tends to really dominate in those districts. And that is a result both of partisan gerrymandering that we've seen across the country. It's also a result of just natural community sorting that we see in communities all over the country. People tend to live in areas with people who think like them, who have the same political views as them. I think there's a little bit of a dispute still about why that happens. Is that a result of people moving to places where their views are shared, or do people actually adapt and adopt the views of the people around them? That's I think still up for debate. But in any event, we just have more homogenous districts. And so what that really means is that the actual contest is in the primary. So if you're in a district that is dominated by Democrats, it doesn't matter as much necessarily who the Republicans nominate, because they may not have much of a competitive chance to win in November. But it really matters who your party nominates for what the direction of your representation is going to be. And so that primary contest really becomes the actual competitive election. And we've seen that change over time. About a third of congressional seats used to be competitive. Now half as many of those really are, and maybe even less now, as we've seen a sort of spate of gerrymandering and redistricting taking place across the country, and that is really concerning, right? We want to make sure that people are fairly represented, and if we have a lot of situations where our politicians and our elected officials are sort of carving out and choosing the electorate they want rather than representing the communities as they exist, you can get kind of skewed representation, and so that raises questions just about what I think someone raised earlier, maybe Scylla, what kind of democracy and representation do we want to have? And so that's why it's important for a lot of voters to be able to participate in our primaries, because that's really where the action is.
And when it comes to uncompetitive districts or redistricting, how legitimate are those races?
So the races are, of course, still legitimate, because all of this, takes place certainly, under law. And, there's a judicial process. There are other processes in many states for challenging the maps that are drawn. And so, in terms of the legitimacy, I don't think there's any question about whether or not those elections are legitimate. I do think we can raise fair questions about whether the design of our democracy really works well. But, people are still able to come out. They are able to vote. We have a lot of questions given recent Supreme Court rulings about racial gerrymandering now. I think that's a separate set of questions about, who gets to participate and how, but I think we should be looking for solutions both for redistricting and our primary systems that seek, a really level playing field, whether it's, about the community you live in, it's about your voter registration status, or whether, it's race or some other characteristic.
So we've been talking about the semi-open primaries as it relates to New Mexico, but what can you tell us on the national level? What types of voting methods are there?
There's a lot, and it actually might help for me to step out and maybe give a global perspective, which is, that the United States is really unique. We're actually really privileged in the United States in terms of how much influence voters have over who party nominees are. In most countries, your regular voters actually don't have any say. Most countries don't have something like a primary election to determine who the nominees will be in the general election. And so that's something that's unique in the United States. It presents challenges at times, but it is also quite a privilege for our voters. Across the country, states are kind of mixed. We've got about 14 states that have what are called open primaries, which is where all voters are able to vote, in a primary where all the candidates are on the ballot, or they can vote in either party's ballot, depending on the state that they're in. Got about 14 states that are closed primaries, including Louisiana, which just moved to a closed primary. This is what New Mexico used to have, which is where only registered party members can participate. And then, we've got a handful of states that use something like what's called top 2 or top 4. California, Washington, and Alaska use this in their primaries. This is a contest where the first stage has all candidates compete against each other, and then a certain number, in these states either 2 or 4 candidates advance to the general election, where the voters will choose the ultimate winner. And so, there is a real variety. And then, adding into the complexity of that, a number of states actually allow their political parties to choose which of these systems they'd like, whether they want to allow unaffiliated voters to participate. So there's a lot more variation across the country, I think, than most people realize.
And do we have a number of states that use open primaries?
Right now, I believe that stands at about 14 that are sort of what are strictly defined as open. New Mexico would not be described as completely open, so that wouldn't be including New Mexico.
And let me ask you as well, what impact has there been in states that have moved to open primaries or semi-open primaries like New Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of really positive developments. So, as I mentioned earlier, we know that when states move to open primaries, that the percentage of unaffiliated voters who are represented in that primary electorate, that goes up. We know that turnout overall increases. But we also know that it, tends to close some racial and ethnic group representation gaps, especially for Latinos and Asians. They are typically not as well represented in the primary electorate, but when states move to more open primaries, they tend to be much more well represented. And so, those are just a handful of the positive developments that more open primary systems bring.
And I just wanted to let our listeners know as well that there will be an article on KUNM's website at kunm.org for the show from the Santa Fe New Mexican that gives more information on the donors behind Accountable New Mexico. And I might want to throw this to Lindsay. Barbara, who we heard from earlier, wants to know how to find 2026 campaign finance reports. She says it's hard to find the data at the Secretary of State's website.
Thank you so much for that question. It's always an interesting science how we communicate things through a website that is responsible for communicating so much. And so recent efforts internally in our office have streamlined the user experience in such a way that it should be easier to find. So you'll want to go to our website and you'll want to click on voting and elections. And then you'll see in a dark blue square something that addresses how you can access the system and search reports online.
Thank you for that. Now, I want to go back to Michael. As we mentioned, this year, New Mexico will be implementing semi-open primaries, but some states that have open primaries currently are considering going back to closed primaries. Why is that?
It's a good question. I think it comes down to something that also Scylla mentioned earlier, which is sort of a changing, philosophy or viewpoint on what the purpose of primaries are and how they should be conducted. And so, for example, Louisiana for a long time had something that was called a jungle primary. It's very close to an open primary. And recently, just before this upcoming primary, the state decided to move to a closed primary election. And, the philosophy behind that you often hear is that, the primaries are really just for the party members to participate. And so you should have to be a registered member of your party to be able to influence who the ultimate nominee is going to be. And that made sense at a time when voters, were much more affiliated with parties than they are now. I think it makes less sense in a time when voters are actually moving away from the parties. Voters are very dissatisfied with the parties, and you can, wind up in a situation where the parties end up nominating candidates that the voters aren't really pleased with because they're not getting the right kind of input, in that narrowing process. And so on top of that, there's a lot of speculation, particularly around Louisiana, but other states who have considered this, that there's actually political motivations, partisan political motivations, but not the kind we usually think of. It's not about Democrats versus Republicans. It's actually about in-party fighting. It's about Democratic and Republican parties having sort of internal battles for power, different ideological groups within the parties who think that if they move to more closed primaries, they will kind of be able to win that internal power struggle. They'll be able to get more of their kind of candidates nominated rather than other members of their party who they don't think represent their views as well. And so while we often hear about Democratic versus Republican fighting when it comes to a lot of electoral reforms, sometimes this is actually about trying, to settle or win internal party battles.
So for closed primaries, do independent voters have to still pay taxes for primaries they are unable to participate in?
It really depends on the state. I don't know of any state that charges, a tax specific to the covering the cost of elections. And so, I imagine in almost every state, it just kind of comes out in whatever your normal, taxes are and how that funding is allocated, through your state legislature. But, it's sort of an interesting note, as we were talking earlier, New Mexico actually used to have party-run primaries. The primaries were not always run by the state, but the state moved away from that. I think for some reasons that had to do with questions about the integrity of those elections and how well they could be trusted. And so New Mexico has been having taxpayer-funded, state-run, county-run primary elections for a while now. And so, it's understandable that some of the philosophy around who can participate in that has started to shift, and why maybe the state has moved to these more open primaries.
And to that, some have argued that political parties should shoulder the financial burden for elections that aren't open to all registered voters. What are your thoughts on that?
I think there is a fairness to that, but the decision is not up entirely to the parties of whether or not they can do that. In most states, the state legislature has stepped in and passed laws, that mandate one way or another how the primaries are to be run. And, every state has laws that dictate how people become nominees on the general election ballot. But, I think if a state wanted to move in that direction, that's a basic, design choice about how you want your state's democracy to work. But that used to be, mostly how, the candidate selection process worked in the United States. But, as I said earlier, with New Mexico's history, that can come with downsides. And so when you turn the election over to the state to be run, there are many more guardrails and protections that ensure those who are supposed to be able to participate can do so.
So, Michael, you were talking earlier about the design of elections. This will be the first semi-open primaries for New Mexico, but can you discuss the notion of whether states should have semi-open primaries altogether?
Well, at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we've supported states moving in that direction because we think it aligns, the outcomes of the primary elections with the general election populace or electorate much better. And we think that not only serves the voters, we think that serves the political parties. Some recent research we've been doing that we haven't published yet, but talking to a lot of political party operatives from across the country, they actually agree with that in large part, that aligning, the primary electorate voter base, what they seem like, with the general election voter base would be much better for the parties and would make their candidates much more competitive in the general election. And so, ultimately, we think that it is a good thing. But, at the same time, the Supreme Court and our long history has recognized that, political parties are not entities of the state. They are, private organizations or institutions, and they have their own rights and their own right to affiliation. And so, there is a limit to how much, a state or even the federal government can try to regulate a political party entity.
So would that mean that there would be one giant primary nationwide on the same date?
Well, there have been ideas about that. At the Bipartisan Policy Center, we have recommended the country moving to something more like a single national primary day for congressional elections. Obviously in each state, in each district, the ballots would all still, be specific to, where the voters live. It wouldn't be one large national ballot. But we think there's a lot of benefit that could come from holding all of those elections on the same date. We have some evidence that suggests our hypothesis is correct about that. And so, we think that's something that should be explored.
And for our listeners, we just want to let you know that we will be putting a link to the 2026 campaign finance data from the Secretary of State's on the Let's Talk New Mexico webpage. And unfortunately, we reached the end of the hour. We want to thank everyone who called in, and a big thanks to all of our guests, Scylla Avci, Molly Swank, Lindsay Bachman, and Michael Thorning for that lovely discussion. I want to keep this conversation going on Facebook at KUNM Radio and on our Instagram at KUNM News. If you missed any part of the show, you can stream it at kunm.org or subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you, as always, to our hardworking team. Our engineer was Marino Spencer. Isla Herndon, our volunteer from Albuquerque Academy, handled the phones today, and Megan Camrick produced the show. I'm Jeanette Didios for Let's Talk New Mexico on 89.9 KUNM.